Okay. So today we have with us Dr. Zachary Moore. So why don't you go ahead and start out by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Well, I do have a doctorate, as you mentioned. I have a doctorate in molecular biology. The official designation is pathobiology and molecular medicine. The easy way of describing that is just molecular biology, or the little tiny things that make life work. So I got that degree at the University of Cincinnati a million years ago. And I left Cincinnati, which is where I grew up. So I'm from that area originally. And I left that. I left there and I came to Dallas, Texas, where I did a postdoctoral fellowship at UT Southwestern Medical Center, which is it's a medical school and research facility here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And after a couple years of that, I left and started doing sort of private medical writing, medical communication stuff. So that's more or less what I do professionally. So I do have a doctorate. I'm not a professor. I sort of adopted the Dr. Zach moniker way back when I started doing my evolution podcast, because a bunch of people just started calling me that, and it kind of stuck. So I answered to Zach or Dr. Zach or Dr. Moore if necessary. But that's usually only in a professional capacity. So
the good doctor,
Yeah. So that's sort of what my professional and academic credentials are. In terms of sort of who I am I presume your audience is a little bit more interested to know like who I am in the atheosphere, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah. So I am a bit of everything. So I've been a blogger. I've been a podcaster. I've been an activist. I've been an organizer at the national level. I've been a speaker, a debater. I guess the only thing that I haven't really been is a quote unquote YouTuber. This is a bit of a new phenomenon that I've kind of retired my way in advance of this becoming kind of a thing. Although I do know some YouTubers, like I know sort of Aaron Ra. I know I don't know if David Smalley is really considered a YouTuber. I guess he's still more of a podcaster. But
right.
some of the other people who are here locally, I know them as well. So I guess that's the only thing that I haven't done. Oh, and I've been an activist, an occasional activist. Like I'm not really a marching up and down with pickets, all the time. But if there's a cause that is worthwhile, I definitely will expend some effort in activism. Yeah.
So I've watched some of your videos, so I kind of know some stuff about your background. So like, what was your religious background and upbringing like?
Very much like yours.
Well, yeah. I kind of converted to that theology later, but so I don't know. Calvinism I'm referring to. But.
Yeah. You were more, I guess, sort of independent Baptist fundy sort of.
Well, I was raised. Well, I was raised kind of like in pop evangelicalism. So we kind of floated around, and I ended up like in high school. We went to like like the First Christian Church. Like they have those everywhere. I guess it's associated with like the Stone Campbell movement. I don't know if that means anything to you. But so my journey into Calvinism was more like, I think my aunt and uncle gave me "Don't Waste Your Life" by John Piper when I was like as a graduation gift or something like that, and I read it, and I wasn't like converted to it on the spot, but that's kind of that started the trajectory in that direction for me.
It was a gateway drug of sorts.
Yes, it was. Glory.
So I was raised in it. And it's funny too, because I look back and like all the things that were surrounding that were all just like, looking back, it's all so weird. But at the time it was normal, right? At the time you're a little kid, this is what church is. So for us, church was it was like a cheap little building that had been built in the backyard of the pastor. So you literally had to go to the pastor's house and go. He had like a kind of a long driveway and a big backyard. So you would go down his driveway and park in the backyard on the grass. And suffice to say, the number of people who enjoyed this type of experience were enough to fit inside a single backyard, right? So this is
Yeah.
This is not a mega church. This is not anything that was ever going to become a mega church either. But it was the head pastor's name was Tom Wells. I think he's passed on now. But he was a very serious Calvinist, and I'll just say right off the bat, like, we didn't consider ourselves Calvinists per se. In fact, I never even heard that term until much later when I started studying theology. We called ourselves Reformed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
we were Reformed, and I think that tends to be the case.
You didn't baptize babies. You're not Reformed. I'm just kidding.
I think that tends to be the case. I don't know why exactly Calvinism is a fine label for the theology, but it's not something that I find many Calvinists labeling themselves as. You know what I mean?
No, I know.
Yeah. At any rate, so we raised in that sort of church, and it was from the Baptist tradition. So it was a Reformed Baptist church. Incredibly unpopular, but there was a tiny little sort of cadre of people my parents' age who all had kids about the same time. And so there was like 3, maybe 4 couples with kids roughly in the same age bracket that sort of glommed onto each other and became like kind of an interesting little supportive family unit, right? Because there's nobody else in your family that understood any of this theology or got it, right? Mm-hmm. And so these people, I saw these people, the church people, our family friends from the church. I saw them more than I saw my own aunts and uncles, more than my own cousins for the most part. So they were much more present in my life because of that. Mm-hmm. And my parents were constantly like going over to their house and having Bible studies and things like that. And again, for me, this was normal. I was very much encouraged whenever I was old enough to like really start to understand the sermon. I was encouraged by my father to like take notes and try to understand it like analytically, mm-hmm. and sort of process it. And the goal was that I would pay attention to the sermon, that I could discuss it with my father after the fact. And I started doing that, and I had a head for it, and it was something. Well, it was more interesting than just sort of sitting in the pew and zoning out, for an hour. And so that became interesting, and they finally developed a Sunday school program, because they hadn't had this, again, because it was so tiny, but they finally developed a Sunday school program. And it was taught by this British guy who taught in the style of like British public schooling, like full-on lectures with all that kind of stuff. And again, it was quite a bit for me to handle. I think I was 8 or 9 or something like that. It was still interesting. And I remember, and the thing that was impressed upon me the most was that these are very serious topics, and understanding this is the most serious and important thing that you will do with your life, right? So it is absolutely critical that you think deeply about this. And so I did. And I was pretty content. I did not have an adolescence marked by sort of doubts or acting out or rebellion or anything like that. Like, I pretty much went with the flow. In fact, this is kind of a long side story, but when I was in high school, finally just about to graduate, the church that we'd been going, so we had actually moved, and it was really hard for my parents to find another church that they loved, because it had to have that really specific theology that you're not going to find, right? It's it's like 0.1% of all Christian denominations or churches will identify that way. So they just weren't able to find it. So the closest they came to being sort of satisfied theologically was this very conservative Presbyterian church, which still was a little bit too goofy, but it was fine. Like, they weren't saying anything that would make them upset at the end of the sermon, really. Up until the point when I was just about to graduate high school, and the church announced that they had plans to start a private school that they would sort of sponsor and be in charge of. And this is a very common thing for churches to do. This is a way of them expanding their influence, et cetera. this was something that my father was very much philosophically opposed to, not theologically opposed to, but philosophically opposed to, because he was actually a public school educator, and he had seen sort of firsthand the damage that had been done to the public school system by specifically evangelical Christians who had removed their kids and set up these private schools and private academies, and as a result, dumped all over the public schools, and anytime any effort was made to sort of improve them or support them, they always had something negative to say about the public school system. And so he had to deal with that, right? So he was sort of balancing that as an evangelical Christian, as well as a public school educator, the idea that there is value to public education, and there are good people in public. And I went to public schools my entire life. I never went to a private Christian school, and I never had a problem. I got a great education, and I would say, I mean, your mileage may vary, of course, but if you are sending your kids to a private Christian school for that reason specifically, you're probably wasting your money. At any rate, so once the church announced that, my father was done with that church. He's like, I'm not going to be a member of the church anymore. And he resigned his membership officially. And my mother did too, because whatever my father would do, my mother would do too. And they tried kind of half-heartedly to find another church to go to, but they'd already sort of gone through that process when we first moved to that area, and they knew that there was really nothing. And so my parents just stopped going to church altogether.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because they couldn't find anything that was sort of jiving with them. I kept going. So this has been impressed upon me that being part of the church body and developing as a Christian was the most important thing. So I'm like, well, I'm not going to give up on this, and maybe this church isn't the right church, but there's other churches that are out there, and I'm going to see what I can find. And so I kept going to churches with my friends, with other people that I knew, with other churches I'd heard of. And so I just never stopped. So my parents stopped going to church, right? So this is sort of a weird that's opposite different. World, right? So normally like, oh no, the kids are just going to stop going to church because if we don't force them to. Well, in this case, my parents stopped going to church. But I kept going.
You were the devout one.
I kept going because I'm like, look, you've been telling me my entire life how serious this is. Why would I think anything different now? Just because you've, been really disappointed by this church or whatever. So I kept going, and so I think, and you and there's probably a lot of people that you'll interact with on Twitter or on this channel that have very similar backgrounds where we took it very seriously. Like this was not a joke. This was not anything that I was in constant rebellion against. I was chafing against the bonds of Christianity or anything like that. It was when you grow up in it, it's not the strictures that are placed on you aren't that hard to deal with. Like the idea of avoiding R-rated movies. It's like, or not swearing. It's like, you just don't. And it's not that hard. It's kind of fun when you finally can. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. But growing up, I've not had it around. Oh, and by the way, is this a swearing friendly channel?
Oh, you can, yeah. I don't care. I just did.
Okay. I just want to clarify.
Yeah, it's up to you. So you were devout. You also moved to Catholicism at one point, if I'm remembering correctly. So how did your explain your theological evolution in the best way you can? Yeah.
So it's a bit of a long story. I touch on this a little bit. I gave a talk at the American Atheist Conference a couple of years ago when I touched on this. So the what ended up happening was I was in school. I was studying science. I intended to sort of be something science medicine related, and I ended up sort of finding a really interesting path in molecular biology, and I was pursuing that. None of that, by the way, science, the studying of science had anything to do with my apostasy whatsoever. It was totally consistent because, and I don't know if this is specific to Calvinism or what, but like you have this idea of God as completely omnipotent and completely sovereign. Like there's nothing that God can't do, and there's nothing that is inconsistent with God like being in charge, right? Mm-hmm. So what does it matter if evolution is true, right? Because it literally cannot contradict this concept of God. And so if evolution is true, that's fine. It must be true in some way that, God caused it or God allowed it or it's with his plan or whatever. So it never bothered me at all.
Calvinist Jesus is already a dick, so why,
Well, that's a separate issue, I think. But at any rate, so I was in school at university level, and I had done a really stupid thing, and I would discourage anybody out there who's in college from doing this. I loaded up on all of my core classes as much as I possibly, if I could fit it into my schedule, like if I could make it work logistically, I did it. So I stacked up organic chemistry, advanced biology, physics. All that stuff was like, I was taking all three of those labs at the same time, in addition to all the other stuff that was going on, calculus, and I had to take French and a few other things. But just stacking up all those cores, because I didn't have to do that. Like, you could have just done biology and chemistry, then put off physics or one of the other two. But I stacked up all my core stuff really early, and so that made the first few years of college really difficult. But then the last year, I was totally wide open. And so I was faced with this really kind of, not a dilemma exactly, but like a kind of little fun little reward almost. Like, well, there's nothing that I really have to take now, so I can take whatever I want. So I looked at the class offerings, and I was just browsing through. And I had never really I think I'd taken one like creative writing class that I thought might be fun. But I'd never done anything in the literature world, even though I love literature, But for me, I was so focused on science. And so anyway, so I looked at the literature offerings, and I saw that there was a class on the literature of the Bible. And I saw that, and I was like, oh, that's perfect. And it was 3 classes: Old Testament, the New Testament Gospels, and then the New Testament, basically the letters of Paul and a few other letters. And I thought, that's perfect, because that'll take me across the whole year. I'm guaranteed an A, because I had read the Bible so many times by that point. I literally read the Bible cover to cover probably about 7, maybe 8 times, because growing up, you come home from church, you read the Bible, and I had to read a book of the Bible every week for years after years after years. And so I was super familiar with the Bible. So I thought, this is perfect. I get 3 A's in a row. I'll boost my GPA. It'll be fun. It'll be interesting. And so I signed up for the class. And that is, and I mentioned that class not to scare people away from taking classes like that, because it wasn't just this class. Like, I can sort of look back in my autobiography a bit and see a bunch of things that either happened to me or choices that I made at the time that like kind of pre-selected me or pre-evolved me into being in the place where apostasy was a viable option. Something like, for example, I was exposed to Carl Sagan when I was in high school. I had this really great teacher who shared with us Carl Sagan, The Demon Haunted World. And I read that book, and I was an evangelical Christian as strong as I could be. And I read that book, and I was like, yeah, this is all great stuff. But I never once applied it to any of my own like core beliefs, right? It's all skepticism that was great for disproving UFOs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But
everything else but my beliefs.
Everything else but my beliefs. And so there was that. There's the Sagan stuff. There's other stuff that kind of like had pre-selected me to that point. But I got to that class because that class is where I had this sort of catalytic moment. And it was a fascinating class, and it was taught by a guy. He was an older gentleman. He had used to be a Presbyterian minister, and he'd actually written one of the textbooks that we used for the class. We also used, I think, the Oxford Study Bible, which was, I want to say is that ESV version? I can't remember off the top of my head.
Probably NRSV or something like that.
Maybe. Not NIV, which is what I grew up with. But anyway, so what was really fascinating to me, and the most interesting thing about that class, was not necessarily anything that you learned about the Bible, though there was lots of that stuff that I'd just never been aware of and never even thought of. But it was the sheer fact of approaching the Bible with a different paradigm, right? So as a Christian, as a believer, the Bible is sacred. The Bible is special. The Bible is the Word of God. And that's not just a phrase that you just say and don't really mean. If it's the Word of God, right? The God, the creator of the universe, the most powerful, knowledgeable, loving entity that has ever existed and never will exist, right? And he's written you a letter and he wants you to read it, right? That's how you treat the Bible. And so you open it up, and the default state of a believer is purely devotional, right? You open up the Bible and all you want to see there is, what is God saying to me? What are the words that are meaningful to me? What can I find in here that will improve my life in some way, or help me solve this problem that I'm facing, or give me some sort of wisdom or clarity, right? That's how you approach it, right? You're just waiting to wash over you and just help you and heal you, almost like it's a sacred talisman, like there's some magic that's going to happen. That is not at all what happens in the class, right? So in the class, you open up the Bible and you start reading it like you would be reading the Iliad or the Odyssey or Beowulf or any other, ancient work of literature. And just doing that was enough of a paradigm shift where I started to realize, oh yeah, this is literature, yes. And I don't think any Christian would disagree with that. But like, I hadn't really thought that through. I hadn't let that cycle through my brain in the same way. Like, yeah, somebody wrote this down and crafted this story, like the story of, Abraham striking the deal with Yahweh, for example. Somebody wrote that down in a similar way to somebody writing down the story of Gilgamesh, right, negotiating with the gods when Enkidu was laying dying. And that had never really, it never really thought about that. And once you start thinking about, well, how would you analyze Gilgamesh to pull out the themes and the literary, the stitches that are underneath, the folds of the cloth, and you look at the Bible, like, yeah, I can kind of see those too,
right?
And the more you look for them, the more evident they are. And you as a believer, you're not looking for them, and so you just don't see them, right? You just don't see them. But as a student approaching it as a work of literature, you start to notice these things, because that's the whole point, is to analyze this literature and to find out what you can glean about how it was constructed, etc. And I started seeing more and more of these very human influences, and not just influences, but like human. I started thinking of them as kind of like thumbprints. Okay, this passage has been smudged up by too many human fingerprints on it, because I know that this is very similar to this Ugaritic story that is not supernatural, so we'll just take that out. And so I started seeing more and more of these human smudges in the Bible, and and all you want to do is preserve what comes from God, because, right, the Bible is the Word of God, right? So that is the core thing that you want to preserve. And the more I tried to do that, the more I realized I can't. There's so little that I can actually preserve, and so much of it is human. And I don't actually know anymore that I can make a strong argument for any of this stuff being of God.
Right.
And this is what led me to this sort of catalytic moment. I didn't even realize what was happening when it was happening, but in retrospect, it's very obvious. I sat there in class, and I think I was putting my books away and about to leave. And I asked myself the question, if I hadn't been raised the way that I was raised, if I hadn't been raised to just accept the Bible as the Word of God, and I didn't know anything about it instead, and I hadn't been raised in that way, and I didn't know anything about the Bible, and now I've learned about it for the first time in this class, would it occur to me, would it seem obvious that this is the Word of God in actuality, that this is communication from the divine? And as soon as I asked myself that question, I knew the answer. It was no,
right?
Absolutely not. And it hit me. It just sort of smacked me, and I was surprised with how obvious it was at that point. And I thought, well, if I wouldn't think that, And the only reason why I do think that now is because my parents told me it was. Why do I accept that? Like, why am I still accepting this? If the only reason I have to go by is this is what my parents have said, right? What arguments can I put together to support this? And so I didn't consider this to be sort of apologetics. I mean, it was a very sort of a personal apologetic, I suppose, but I didn't reach out to any of the classical Christian apologists. I just sort of studied the Bible more, because I'm like, okay, well, there's got to be something more to this. And I kept trying to sort of figure out, well, what can I preserve? What can I save? Like, maybe I can't preserve the specific type of Christianity that I was raised in. Maybe that doesn't really make sense anymore. But there's got to be some sort of Christianity that doesn't make sense, that you could jive with the Bible, right? And so that's sort of what I tried to do. And then eventually I got to the point where, like, well, you can't really. All forms of Christianity, you can't really get them from the Bible either. Well, but there's got to be some importance to Jesus, right? So Jesus is a character that is super relevant, and at the time I thought, absolutely surely did exist in history and said these really important, meaningful things, and if nothing else, we can take from his teachings something and create something out of that. But then you can't really. So I was studying the works of the Jesus Seminar at the time, and they had put together. They'd gone through this whole voting thing, right? So what sayings of Jesus do you think are actually historically true? And there's this whole voting thing, and they came up with this final list of the things that they could all sort of agree on. Yeah, these are probably things that somebody said historically, maybe not Jesus, but somebody said these historically. And there's like a dozen of them, a dozen sayings that are not related to each other, that don't create any sort of theological understanding of anything. No, certainly no religious system is supported by any of it. You could barely even get a sense of like what God is from that. It's like it's barely even theistic from those sayings. And so I'm like, well, then Jesus might have been a nice guy, but he's completely irrelevant then. If this is really all that we can point to. And so Jesus was out. And then, well, there's got to be some role for God. And there was very little that I could do then at that point from the Bible to justify, because that's a very specific God, right? It's not capital G God like everybody thinks of. It's Yahweh. It's a very specific personal God. And I thought, well, and this is when I started interacting with some of the atheistic philosophy, atheology arguments. And I just started reading some of the more like strong atheistic argumentations and things like that. And I was like, yeah, this is persuasive. This is definitely more persuasive than the other side. And at that point, I'm like, well, I think that's about as far as I can go.
You shaved it all off.
It's all gone. And it was not for lack of trying. And that whole process probably took, I don't know, 3 years, 4 years. It was a long time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, my deconversion was more Bible-based as well. I mean, so far, like I identify as agnostic right now with respect to theism, but that's probably going to change, to atheism eventually. But like Bible and miracle issues were big for me. So like the resurrection, I've said this in other streams, but I'm naturally skeptical of miracle claims anyway, even as a Christian, kind of as you maybe had hinted at. So the plausibility of the resurrection was undergirded with other beliefs. And so I assumed that the prophecy pointing to Jesus was pretty clear, that this book was, these claims were being made in this book that was obviously from God, and that the Gospels were historically reliable. And, once those all start to be pulled out, I'm just left with this, claim, super miracle claim with nothing to like stand other than, okay, so the Gospels traditionally it's said that it's non-eyewitness testimony,
right.
You have non-eyewitnesses saying that a guy came back to life and floated into the sky. That's not enough for me unless I have other reasons undergirding it to believe that. And religious experience too. I had personal experiences that convinced me at the time that Christianity was true. And with Reformed theology, a lot of it, really does rest ultimately on personal experience. For some, at least in the confessions, it's like, the ultimate answer to how the Bible's God's word is the Holy Spirit testifying in your heart that it's true. That's pretty much just like purely personal experience. So.
Yeah, that's what the Mormons say too, and
exactly.
you don't give them any benefit for that.
But my experience is true and theirs isn't.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's what it comes down to.
Yeah,
so my Catholicism then was kind of a function of that stripping down process, and once I'd gotten down to the point where I could not use the Bible anymore to justify the type of Christianity that I was raised in. There was a point in which I said, well, is there any type of Christianity that I could appeal to where the Bible doesn't matter? Like, because I can't appeal to that anymore to justify my own theology. But is there a type of Christianity that for whom not that the Bible is irrelevant, but that it's not used as the baseline? And the answer for me at that point was, well, Catholicism. Because and that's not really meant pejoratively, but Catholicism uses the Bible, and the Bible is definitely important, but the Bible is not the foundation. The foundation is the tradition that's handed down, the dogma of the magisterium. And so I thought, well, if I can't rely on the Bible, I can at least, this is an institution that has been in continuous existence for 2,000 years, and the founders of this church, so I thought, were the disciples of Christ and the apostles that he had sent out. And so I thought, well, if I can at least hang my hat on that tradition, like this is an unbroken chain going all the way back to the first Christians. And so that's why Catholicism became attractive to me. It also is the case generally that because of that, Catholicism allows for a lot more intellectual exploration. And a lot of the scholars that I was reading at the time tended to be Catholic for that reason, because they didn't actually have to toe a particular party line. As long as they were Catholic,
right,
they could pretty much come up with anything they want, which is not the case for evangelicals. You really do. No. You have to follow this very straight and narrow doctrinal line, or else you're out, as we saw with William Dembski. He was thrown out of the seminary here because he was so he used to be a professor at Southwestern Seminary, and he was thrown out because he did not affirm a literal flood.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
Yeah. But I mean, like this Bill Dembski from the Discovery Institute, one of the arch intelligent design, like fundamentalist guys, and definitely fundamentalist, not fundamentalist enough to partake in this system. So he was thrown out.
Didn't Mike Licona lose his job at one seminary too? I thought he might have.
Did he lose his job? He's now at Houston Baptist. I know he ran afoul of Geisler.
Yes,
Norman Geisler, because he does not affirm, or he suggests that the little apocalypse was not historical.
Right. Yep.
So I don't know if he may have lost his job and then ended up at HBU as a result. HBU is one of these sort of places that is starting to collect some of these erstwhile fundamentalist apologists into one place. So
yeah,
that could be the. I don't recall exactly with Licona.
Yeah. So now you've deconverted from Reform to Catholicism to atheism, and then you started to try to interact and reach out to apologists and like have not just apologists, but like have conversations with Christians. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that chapter?
Yeah,
I know that you don't do it as much anymore with evangelicals, but yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah. So it was I just moved to Texas, and the transition of moving from Ohio to Texas more or less coincided with sort of finally getting over the now you're an atheist sort of a thing. So I was finally like kind of done with exploring my own religious identity, and I figured, well, look, I think I landed on atheist at this point, so that's fine, that's done, that's over with. And I assumed that I would like never step foot in a church again because there'd be no reason to. but I was still I was very active on a couple of websites. At the time, there were only a handful of atheist websites. There was or that were specifically targeted towards apostates, I suppose. There's xchristian.net. There's losingmyreligion.com, and then there was the Internet Infidels, which still exists. And the Internet Infidels at the time, I don't know if they still do, but at the time they had a message board, and I was on it from time to time. And somebody, it was soon after I'd moved to Texas, somebody posted, hey, anybody who's in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, just want to let you know, there is a Southern Baptist church that has invited some atheists to speak at their Sunday school class.
Yeah.
And if you're in the area, we'd love for you to come out and support us. And so I was like, that's so amazing. That is I'd never heard of any church inviting atheists to come, to welcoming them and providing a platform for them. That was just so weird and foreign. I'd never heard of that before. And I thought, well, that's just so interesting. I have to go to that. And plus I looked up where the church was, and it was super close to me. And I thought, well, I've just got to go. So I went to that church on Sunday morning for their Sunday school class, and it was a fantastic event. So it was actually run by this really great guy named Kevin Harris. And you probably don't know Kevin, but you probably have heard his voice if you've listened to any of Bill Craig's podcasts, because Kevin is Bill's producer. And so, you know how there'll be a conversation between Bill and some guy with this really sexy radio voice?
Yeah.
That's Kevin.
You're right.
And so Kevin was a member at this church, and he was very passionate about apologetics, as you can imagine, being Bill Craig's producer, very passionate about apologetics. And he had created this specific Sunday school class just to talk about apologetics issues. And it was his idea to invite these atheists to come. And so I went there and I saw, and he pretty much just interviewed them, like they were a guest on his radio show, basically. And it was a very, very nice exchange. There were there's some questions and answers. The people from the church got up and asked questions of them, and I just kind of sat there and watched the whole thing. I thought it was fantastic. And afterwards, I said to myself, uh-oh. Did I lose you? I think I lost you, bud. Okay, we're back. I lost you for a second.
I don't know. This happened last time too. I don't know why it keeps doing this. I don't know if my internet just seizure randomly. I don't know.
Internet weirdness, I guess. But anyway, so at the end of it, I thought to myself, this is amazing. These are both really great groups of people. I was really impressed with the atheists. I was really impressed with Kevin and the people there at his class. And I said, this is what I've been looking for. This is where I want to be. Not at the church as a member, but where these conversations are happening. This is where I want to be. And so I introduced myself to Kevin. I introduced myself to the atheists. And for a couple years, I every Sunday I would come to that church, and I was a member of Kevin's Sunday school class, and I was the only atheist in the class. I was the only atheist that came at all. I think I was sort of like the pet atheist almost. Anytime any question would come up, about oh well, do atheists actually think this? They was like, what do you think, Zach? I was like, no, not really.
It's a no from me.
Yeah. And then the atheists, likewise, they had an organization called the Church of Free Thought, which actually was a church. It was recognized legally as a church in the state of Texas, believe it or not. And I started hanging out with them and getting involved with them. And eventually they offered me a leadership position with their group. And that's what led me to doing all the local organizing stuff that I do, or that I have done over the past 10 years.
Right.
So, but I spent 2 years with Kevin, getting to know him, having these great conversations with him every week, and his people in his class. And unfortunately, after 2 years, the church underwent a transition. They got the old pastor left, who was very pro apologetics, and they brought in this new pastor who was very sort of old school Southern Baptist, and he once he found out that there was a class talking about, does God exist? He's like, no, that is not going to happen here. We don't even ask that question. In this church, God exists, period. And so he told Kevin, like, this class you either end the class entirely or you turn it into just a regular, like, Bible study Sunday school class. And I think he toyed with the idea of trying to do like a regular class but I told him, like, Kevin, I'm here for the apologetics. I'm not here for Bible study, because I've done that in the past and I know how worthless it is, and I'm not going to do it again. So thank you, but I'll see you. But I kept in touch with him, and I'm still consider Kevin a friend. But that's sort of what sparked in me the interest of, these conversations are really great and interesting. And I eventually came up with the idea for a podcast called Apologia based on that idea. And that's what led to that. So I started, the very first podcast I did was the evolution one. And then after that, I broadened it out into religious topics with Apologia. And Kevin, if anybody's ever listened to that, Kevin is, of course, a very regular guest in the discussion there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, though, because honestly, I feel like, having a class discussing that and having real atheists give their positions, it might cause doubt, in the short term. But if you consistently straw man other people's positions, like some of those people do in these Sunday school classes on apologetics, and there's no input from like real atheists, then when people get out into the real world and actually like meet atheists and like read literature, then they're going to be like, feel lied to, because, they're not actually getting the real views. So in a way, if I were a Christian, I would do what he did and try to do, I understand the worry, but it's like in the long term, I think they're damaging it more by this insular way of doing it. Anyway, I don't know.
That's the reasonable approach. That's not the approach we would expect from apologists in general, and certainly not Southern Baptist churches.
Yeah. So you started doing that, but then, you also had bad experiences trying to interact with evangelicals. Do you want to elaborate a little bit about that? Like how you were excited about it, you were doing it, and then all of a sudden it kind of took a turn.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, so there's not any one like bad experience necessarily. It's just sort of like it's like a pattern of, okay, there's this really unfortunate experience, and then another one, and then another one, and you start to wonder, eventually, maybe this is the rule, not the exception. You know what I mean? So, for example, I was invited to. So after one of our local activism outreach events, initiatives, whatever you want to call it, we had this billboard that we put up, and it got a lot of attention and ended up in the New York Times and on Fox News. And one of the guys that got sort of wrapped up in this from the Christian side, I reached out to him and I said, hey, I saw, because he was talking about us on Fox News, and I said, yeah, you're talking about us, but you've never met us. Why don't we meet? Why don't we have lunch? And so I met him for lunch. He's a nice guy, he's just kind of a standard, evangelical Christian, right? He's got this particular way of looking at the world. His own conversion experience was that he had been raised, in a more or less Christian household, but never really cared about it until his wife drug him to church one day, and because she was worried, because I guess his best friend had cheated on his wife or something like that. There was some sort of infidelity that had happened in close proximity to his own marriage, and so his wife drug him to church, presumably to put the fear of God into him or something like that.
Yeah,
literally. And he was there, and he said while the pastor was praying, he opened up his eyes and he saw the entire roof of the church lift up, and 1,000 angels poured into the church, into the main sanctuary, and started singing while the pastor was praying. And then once the prayer came to an end, the angels flew out and the roof closed back over it. And he said, and at that point I gave my heart to God. And I said, Really? That's so weird. I've never seen anything like that. Even when I was a Christian, I've never seen like the root. But anyway, so this is just, and I don't mean to say that to make fun of, but this was like he was happy to tell the story. Like this is how he believes that what he saw was real, right? So he had whatever experience that he had. I have no idea if he was just falling asleep or if he had some other psychedelic in his system. I don't know. But he viewed that experience as transformative, and he became a devout evangelical because of that. After that experience, he invited me to go to his church, actually, and talk to his Sunday school class in a very similar way to that Kevin had done to these other atheists. And I did that. And for the most part, everybody there was polite. But I got a lot of like nasty looks and side glares and a lot of pushback on stuff that I was saying. I actually recorded this. You can't really see the audience, but it's on my YouTube channel. It was Heath Hill's church, Lake Point. I got a lot of pushback from most people, and they were not happy to hear what I had to say for the most part. Afterwards, there was one couple in this whole group came up to me and they said, "Yeah, we really loved what you were talking about and how you're describing, sort of being a free thinker and the way you think about the world." And they said, do you think it's possible that we could be free thinkers and be Christians at the same time?" And I said, "Boy, that's a tough question. I think it's possible, but it'd be really hard to keep doing both, because so many of if you approach the world, again, being a free thinker, the way I look at it, being a free thinker means that the beliefs you form, the beliefs don't matter, but whatever beliefs you have to be formed by appealing to reason and evidence, and not things like tradition or superstition or this is just the way it's always been, right? And so if that's your approach, then yeah, it's possible to be a Christian, perhaps, but it'd be really hard. And I was really impressed by that one couple, but then I thought that was just one couple out of like this entire group of people.
Yeah.
And I would occasionally get like some positive feedback from, and I would live for those moments. And I don't mean to say that my time was exactly completely wasted. I mean, I would say that a lot of it was ultimately wasted, but there were individuals that connected with me over the years, and there's certainly people that have connected with me that have deconverted as a result of our conversations. Even those conversations that happen on Twitter. This actually came up a few days ago. Somebody was asking, has anybody ever changed their mind on Twitter because of any of these debates or conversations? Like, yeah, they have. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's happened enough with me that I've actually, there's been a person named Zach Moore who deconverted after a conversation with me. Wow. And yeah, it was a funny event. So it was during the first Reason rally. I don't know if you're familiar with the Reason rally? It was a few years ago.
Vaguely, I think.
Yeah, they had two of them. It's so funny. So you're about 10 years younger than me. It's so funny that people in your age bracket have really no idea of like the past 10 years, really. You're coming to this brand new, especially if you've recently deconverted.
Yeah, a couple of years ago.
Yeah, but it's just funny that all these events that seemed so significant at the time really kind of faded from history in a major way. But anyway, so the Reason Rally was this massive. It was almost like a political demonstration of sorts. It was in Washington, D.C. It was organized by American Atheists and a bunch of other groups. And I wasn't able to be there, but I was on the Twitter hashtag for it, and there were a bunch of apologists on the hashtag too, sniping.
Yeah. Right.
And I ended up going back and forth with this one guy who he happened to be named Zach Moore. And so we thought we sort of were attracted to each other just because we had the same names. But he was a Presbyterian minister, and I was an atheist organizer, and so we started sniping back and forth. And but I think he followed me, and I followed him afterwards. And then it was about a year later he reached out to me, and he says, "Yeah, we need to have a talk because there has been a change for me."
Wow.
So yeah, so he's no longer a minister. suffice to say. But I think he's a lot happier. Anyway, what was I saying?
I'm trying to remember.
I kind of got far afield there.
That's fine. No, well, you were saying like just being disappointed in the reactions that you get.
Yeah. So so there was that, and then there's some other events. Like I would go to a lot of apologetics events, and the first one that you go to is sort of exciting, and you're seeing these people for the first time. But eventually you start realizing that, they really only kind of say the same thing over and over and over again. And that's kind of the realization that only hits with time, I want to say. And, somebody like Bill Craig, as smart as the guy is, he's kind of a one-trick pony. Yeah. And I don't mean that to dismiss him. He's a one-trick pony with a very good trick, right? There's a reason why he uses the same approach over and over and over again, because it's effective. But it's effective at keeping Christian doubters from straying too far, right? So it reinforces their core doubts, and then he always ends with an appeal, personal experience, appeal to the gospel, and that for an atheist, that's totally meaningless, and he knows that. Who it is meaningful for is a doubting believer who wants a reason to stay in the faith, right? So just to see something like that, just over and over and over again, and then I've had some, personal experiences with Bill Craig where he's just been very obtuse and dismissive, and doesn't really take he doesn't take the time to really learn anything about anyone, because and to be fair, the way that he structured his career, he doesn't have the time to care about any particular person, right? From his perspective, there's atheist arguments like 1 through whatever, and all he has to do is size you up with what he thinks your argument is going to be, and then he's got a response, and then that shuts you down, right? And so, but you could program a computer to do that, you know what I mean? Yeah. And seeing him just do that over and over again has been really disappointing, and especially with me. And I've got to know him because like I said, he was Kevin was his producer, and so Bill would come to class on the regular, because whenever he was in town, he would come to class, so they would record a bunch of shows together. And so I got to meet him, and I'm like, I'm nobody to him, you know what I mean? And all these other apologists too, like I'm nobody to them. I've met Mike Licona, I've met who's the tactics guy? What's his name?
Greg Kokel. Yeah,
I've met Greg Kokel, and he's a nice guy in person, but he doesn't really give a shit. And what's the new guy? He used to be like a forensic investigator.
J. Warner Wallace.
I've met him too. He's very much like Greg Kokel. He's a very nice guy, very polite, absolutely does not give a shit about you personally. And again, like that kind of what they have set up for themselves to be as apologists on this sort of celebrity circuit, whatever it is, it kind of requires that, right? So they can't actually care about any of these people that they're talking with, but it starts to show after a while, and they make mistakes and they make generalizations about you that just aren't true, and they should know better. But it's easier for them and it's faster for them to just make these generalizations because it gets to the heart of what they're trying to get to their real audience. And their real audience is not atheists. Their real audience is doubting Christians, which is why I have a hard time getting on the Randall Rouser train.
I think he's admitted that a lot of his apologetics or to defend. Like I think he's open about that. It's not always to convert, believers. It's to. So anyway, I think he's embraced that aspect. But
yeah, but what I've I would admit that what I've seen of him, he is he's at least the most introspective, probably, of all the other evangelical apologists. But he is sloppy enough that I don't, for me personally, having seen that sort of sloppiness before, and that sort of impersonality, and I just don't care. And so, yeah. So, I mean, for me, I suppose the real, the main event, I suppose, that really kind of solidified it for me was the election of Trump. And seeing, because there were, and I remember leading up to that election, 2016, there were I don't know that it was a majority, but there was a number of evangelical apologists that were very clearly never Trumpers, or were sort of positioning themselves as never Trumpers. And for all the reasons that an evangelical Christian should be a never Trumper, right? All the reasons that you and I know.
Yes.
And so I thought at the time, wow, that's really great to see them like acting in a way that is actually consistent with their theology, even though it might, it might hurt them politically, or they definitely, because even at the time there was a very clear sort of Republican bias for evangelical, well, certainly for evangelical Christianity, but also within the evangelical apologetics world. And I thought it's really great to see them being consistent with their theology, even if it hurts them politically, with their followers or whatever. I have not seen any of that after he was elected. All that went away. And what I saw instead were a lot of, not necessarily the apologists, though I think Craig has been, didn't Craig was asked about this, and he said something that was not an endorsement of Trump necessarily, but it was like a well, we can be, we can be fine with Trump or something like that. Like it was like a real like soft sell,
right?
And that I thought was disappointing. Also to see Eric Metaxas go so far on the
Didn't he? Isn't he on video like hitting, like punching someone? Did you see that?
Yeah, I saw that.
I don't know what happened to that guy.
And he so there was some, and the guy was surely a jerk. He was some guy riding his bike around. It was after a Trump rally, and he was saying Trump sucks and whatever else. But you can see in the video, as he goes past Metaxas just turns around and cold cocks him, total sucker punch.
Yeah.
And then the next thing, Metaxas is bravely running away from the guy, because now the guy's, of course he can take a punch probably. So he's getting up, and now he's going after Metaxas. He's like, oh, you punched me. All right, here we go. Metaxas wants none of that. He's only about the sucker punch. And to see a guy who wrote the biography, one of the definitive biographies of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, go so far for Trump, it's kind of sickening. And there's a Methodist friend of mine. He's a pastor actually, and he didn't know that. I mentioned that to him. He did know Metaxas as the author of Bonhoeffer, but when I mentioned that he was basically writing this, kid's hagiography of Trump, he couldn't believe it. He's like, no, it's got to be a different Metaxas. I said, no, it's the same Metaxas. Yeah. And to see stuff like that, and also to not hear condemnation, like, where did the condemnation go? And so it's just been totally disappointing, and it just it all culminated with kind of a question, and me asking a very similar question to the one that I asked myself after that Bible's literature class. Sort of a self-introspective, navel-gazing sort of a question, but still, why am I doing this? Who am I helping with this? With all the stuff that I've done, with the debates, with the activism, all the other conversations, have I actually made any progress? Am I actually helping? And I couldn't come up with a compelling answer. It certainly is the case, and and there's no shame in this. It certainly has been the case that a lot of it has been because of my own psychological need to pursue these sorts of conversations, to sort of process my own past and deal with a lot of the beliefs that I used to have. But does it actually help other people? I don't know. And to the extent that it makes a difference among evangelicals, I can say even less about that. So, I don't know. I was asking myself if there was a reason to care about evangelicals the way that I had cared about them, or if the only reason that I cared about them is because I used to be one. Mm-hmm. And if I hadn't used to be one, would I, looking around at sort of the state of Christian evangelicalism, would I give two shits about these people, right? Have they dug themselves a pit totally on their own, and they're now sitting in it and now facing repercussions of being where they are, right?
Just like let them implode on their own.
Let them implode on their own. They're doing a heck of a job.
Yeah. That's one of the, just kind of a side thing, like, because I do converse with people on Twitter about some of this stuff, but I've made the observation before. It's like some of these people defending certain views, it's like you're doing a better job undermining your Christianity than I am, because of these views you're defending. Like, I can just, in a way, sometimes just kind of sit back and like, okay, if you're gonna defend this Old Testament violence in this way, I'll just step back and do you, and you're undermining all this stuff better than I am. So
it's like Bill Craig with the slaughter of the Midianites, right? Mm-hmm. So it's numbers 31, right? So yeah, so the argument that he makes is that it's actually number one, it was a good, and this is an argument that other apologists make. Number one, that it was a good thing that the Hebrews, took these young girls as slaves, sex slaves, whatever, however you want to call them. But he goes one step further, and this, to his credit, like, he does really lean into the ramifications of his views. And he does sort of accept them. He said, look, the real moral problem is not whether or not these Midianites were killed or experienced genocide. The real moral problem is that the Hebrew soldiers, the men who were tasked with slaughtering the Midianites, that they probably felt really bad about it.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yes,
and so they had to undergo this, and that's a serious thing that is coming from him. And I'm like, why do people just look at that? Just listen to that, right? Why do people take this guy seriously? And again, he is not an idiot, but he knows that everything that he says just helps these doubting believers because you've got to say something ridiculous like that, because the only other conclusion is this was all immoral. What the Hebrews did was immoral. At the command of Yahweh was immoral. And that is untenable. Any conclusion, anything that leads you in that direction cannot be entertained at all. So any alternative, no matter how stupid, no matter how ridiculous, has to be true. Because you cannot accept the possibility that the Bible is not true, that Yahweh did not exist, all of it. And that's the fundamental problem that apologetics has. And every apologist, no matter how sweet and lovely and fluffy they might be, they're all They're all suffering from this same stricture, whether they realize it or not. They are not allowed to look on the other side of the fence. They can't go over there, because once they do, they've demonstrated to the people on the inside of the fence that there's no such thing as a fence. And that's what is the fence is the thing, right? That's the whole point of creating these institutions, these doctrines, these orthodoxies. The whole point is to maintain the borders of this fence and keep people inside of it. And if you can jump over the fence and look on the other side, then there's no point to the fence. The fence doesn't exist. So they can't do it.
Well, that's why one of the reasons I like some of the more liberal-leaning Christians is because, in their version of they keep the Bible still inspired, but they're like, well, we don't interpret Yahweh's just depicted as in these ways. He didn't really do X, Y, or Z, and so that's way more of an empathetic approach. So I respect that to a degree. But the thing that sometimes liberal-leaning Christians will be like, people that deconvert for Bible reasons or something like that, they'll be like, "Oh, you're unsophisticated. You had a wooden literalist view and you couldn't adopt." Well, my issue with that is once you say that, once you have stripped away everything and you're saying that God inspired this very human-looking collection of texts, well, isn't this the simpler explanation? If you can explain all of this by just appealing to human beings, then that's the simpler explanation than adding an additional divine claim on top of that. So sure, I think, you could call anything inspired, but the thing is, if I'm skeptical that if you're telling me this is the God's word, what features in the text are you going to appeal to if you're basically admitting that it's a very human book?
Yeah.
It's just purely religious experience.
Yeah.
Your religious experience. So what do you use? Anyway, I don't want to go on a tangent about that, but
no, but that's important to point out, because so there is absolutely a tension with liberal Christians. So there's a tension with fundamentalists too, right? So the tension with fundamentalists is that is the tension between their very literal interpretation and reality, right?
Yeah.
So they are totally at odds, right? Their Bible world and the real world are totally at odds, and that's a tension for fundamentalists. But liberal Christians have a tension too. So liberal Christians have a tension between, and you just pointed out, the Bible, right, and the world. But they're trying to figure out, okay, what from the Bible can I take and treat as metaphorical in order to make the world work, right? So that I don't look like an idiot like those fundamentalists, right? But what they're figuring out is the more and more they sort of downplay the Bible, the more secular they seem. And I think we're now starting to see a kind of a turning point with liberal believers, where I think they're gonna reach a point where they stop and look around and realize we've given up too much of the Bible on our journey towards liberal theology. We've given up too much of the Bible, and we need to run back to it and grab as much as we can. This is a kind of a similar phenomenon to what happened in the German Pietist movement, I think, in the 18th century, 19th century, that eventually led to Methodism. But there have been, I don't know if you've noticed this, but there have been some Christians who are definitely liberal believers calling themselves weird Christians. Have you seen this?
I don't think so.
I've seen this. I've just seen it a few places, but I've seen it enough that it's starting to be like, okay, this might be a thing that's happening. But the thing about weird Christians is they're definitely liberal believers, but they're trying to smuggle in as many fundamentalist concepts as they can. So, things like, obviously not the flood, but things like, but demons are real, right? So demons are real entities that float around in space and cause me to have mental health issues or whatever, right? Which that in and of itself sounds like something a fundy would say, but these are people that come from very very liberal denominations. They probably have a female pastor. They're at a LGBT sort of affirming congregation, but they've got this weird sort of demon belief thing on the side, and they lean into that. And so those sorts of things, they're kind of leaning into that and saying, yeah, we believe in this stuff too. And the only reason they're doing it, I think, is because it doesn't conflict directly with any of their other core theological beliefs, right? So they can bring it back in without hurting anything else. But they know it sounds goofy, so they're just sort of like, yeah, we're weird Christians. Hey, I'm cool, I'm hip, I know what the latest music is, and I can make you a latte, or I know where the latest the best beers can be found, or the microbrew, or the gastropub, or whatever. We'll go listen to live music, and then I'll tell you all about demons and how you should be worried about them in your life, and these incantations that you can add to your prayers to keep the demons away, stuff like that. Goodness. And so those are weird Christians. So we should be looking out for them, because I think the weird Christians are coming.
Well, one of the other things, though, that I feel like in certain areas, it's kind of, I guess I would say it's a good thing. It seems like in like philosophical circles, it seems like because the problem of evil is a huge problem, it seems like more people are starting to embrace like an animal afterlife, like concepts like that, or like more of an ultimate redemptionist picture of where ultimately everyone, because like the data of suffering is just so overwhelming, and like once you spend time, and so it just the only if I somehow came back to Christianity, I would have to like adopt these kind of weird theodicies, because it's like, how else can this be paid back? I'm not saying it makes sense to me at all right now, but it seems like there's a move towards maybe more universalist pictures, or like, an afterlife for animals, so that it makes sense on evolution somehow. Yeah. So, I'm all for that for Christians. I want to move as many Christians away from fundamentalism as I can, but it's interesting just as we become more pluralistic, and you've talked about like other things, like the internet is a huge thing. It's pretty new, and we're all kind of engaging and interacting with each other now. Yeah. It'll be weird to see how religion evolves after the internet. I think you shared something about like a link the other day about Iran being like super secular. Yeah. Like that's crazy. I was wondering how the internet would affect like Middle Eastern countries like that. And I was thinking that might be what's happening, but you don't necessarily see that until there's like articles like that point out that might be happening. So
and it has been happening. There have been ex-Muslims for a long time. Unfortunately, in America, I don't know if this is the case everywhere else. In America, we're in a kind of this weird position. Because, obviously 9/11 happened. We just went through the anniversary of it a couple of days ago. 9/11 happened, and the response to 9/11, maybe not the initial response, but the prolonged response to 9/11, including the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, was very much framed in evangelical terms as a kind of a crusade where Christianity was fighting against Islam. Right. And it absolutely was the case, certainly in the aftermath of 9/11, that there was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment, and, all that is all very unfortunate. And, Muslim Americans have had to deal with a whole bunch of crap, basically, for the past 20 years as a result. Because of all that, criticisms of Islam, which are necessary when discussing, ex-Muslims, right? So there's one of the seminal books in that regard is written by Ibn Warq, Ibn Warq is a nom de plume. That's not the author's real name, for the reasons that if his real name were found out, then he probably would be targeted for violence or murder, right? And so that's a real thing. Salman Rushdie was targeted for murder. And one of the reasons why Hitchens was so enthusiastic about criticizing Islam was because he was actually Rushdie's roommate at the time, right? So the idea of Muslim Islamic extremists coming after Rushdie to kill him, I mean, Hitchens was in the firing line for that too, potentially. And so criticism of Islam, which is necessary from a theological standpoint, when we're discussing these apostates, which ex-Muslims are, they're apostates just like you and I are apostates from Christianity, has taken on a political flavor, and therefore criticism of Islam and criticism of any Muslim in general is seen as one and the same, and is considered to be a function of evangelical Christian conservative politics, right? So we have, unfortunately, not been we have not had as much of a awareness in this country of the incredible strides that ex-Muslims have made. So I want to make sure that I give all due credit to ex-Muslims of North America and some of the other organizations that are involved with promoting secularization, not just in Muslim countries but throughout the world. And in America, because that's considered to be right-wing politics or a function of right-wing politics, it gets swept under the rug, or it's not discussed as much as it really should be. But there's been a lot of really fantastical people in the ex-Muslim community, and there are more, right? There are absolutely more, and there's a lot that are outside the United States, outside Canada, that are doing really, really great work. And so I'm really encouraged to see that. I'm not maybe as surprised as you might be, that because Iran has a very interesting history, right? So Iran is basically the source of Zoroastrianism, which is this ancient religion that probably is the reason why Judaism is the way that it is, and thus indirectly influences Christianity and Islam, actually. But so Iran has been this very, very diverse, fascinating culture for a long, long, long time, and it's only since the late 1970s, when the revolution happened, that it became this, quote unquote, Shia Muslim stronghold. But the data that I was sharing in that link suggests that, not really. Only about 30% of the people that were surveyed said, "Yeah, I'm a Shiite," and everybody else was something else. And that is tremendous. I mean, to me, that suggests that Iran is less of a Shia country than the United States is evangelical country, by far.
Right.
Which is great.
Yeah. So before we've been going for a little over an hour. Before we wrap this up, since you did a lot of stuff about evolution and all that stuff, why don't you give a quick case for evolution? Like if you're talking to an evangelical who doubted evolution, how would you if you lay out a quick case or like the lines of evidence in favor of it? Just so we got to touch on evolution, because you had you had the podcast and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so if I was talking to an evangelical,
just someone that doubts.
No. But this is a point I want to make, though. So someone who doubts evolution is only doubting it for theological reasons.
Yeah.
Right? So we should be crystal clear on this. And I had a conversation one time. So I was over at a friend's house. This friend was an evangelical. They are no longer anymore, but they were running their youth group at their church, and they had all these kids over from the youth group, and I was over there just to kind of hang out and talk a little bit. And my friend introduced me to this girl who he said, she's super into science. You should probably talk to her. And I said, okay, that's cool. He says, yeah, and she's super into evolution too. And I said, oh, okay, that's cool. And he's like, yeah, you should ask her. And I said, okay. And so I said, so, my buddy here said that you're really into evolution, and I should ask you about it. And she says, oh yeah, I just think it's so funny how everyone makes this big deal about evolution and why it's bad and we shouldn't believe in it and it undermines our beliefs. I'm like, that's stupid. And I said, oh wow, that's led you to this? And she's like, oh, it's just obvious, isn't it? I mean, you just look at everything. It's obvious that everything evolved. And I said, yeah. So like, did you study this in school then? It's like, yeah, we had like a unit on evolution, and I was just, it was fine. Like, what's the big deal? And I said, wow. So, you don't have a problem with any of it. Like the idea of all living creatures being sort of related to each other, or having sharing genes in common and all that kind of stuff. That's no big deal. And she's like, oh yeah, that's fine. I said, yeah, okay. So even like humans and chimpanzees being cousins, like that's not a problem for you. And she says, oh no. and I said, oh, so that is a problem. She said, yeah, humans and chimpanzees aren't cousins. And I said, so
this is selective.
why do you say that? She says, well, because humans were made in the image of God. And I said, but not chimpanzees. No, chimpanzees evolved. And I said, but humans and chimpanzees share all this DNA, and if you do sort of a cladistic analysis of all these creatures, and you base them on how closely they're related by DNA, it's pretty clear that humans are in the primate clade, and we're closer to chimpanzees than we are to anything else, right? She says, well, that doesn't mean anything. And I said, so what exactly are you saying? Like, you accept evolution except when it comes to whether or not humans and chimpanzees are related? She said, yeah, because humans are made in the image of God. And I said, okay, that's fine. What you're telling me, though, is not from science, right? You didn't study this idea that humans are made in the image of God. This is not from a science textbook, right? Oh, no. I said, yeah, that's fine. It's from the Bible, right? So what you're telling me is from the Bible. And as long as you get that you are fine with the science up until this point, and that your particular belief about this comes only from the Bible, then I got nothing else to say. Because I'm not going to argue with you if your beliefs on this matter have nothing to do with science. If they come from the Bible, they come from the Bible, and that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you there. So that's the sort of thing that I would say to any evangelical or any person that was doubting evolution, right? So the only reason that they are is because they believe, or they've been told, that there is some inconsistency, there's some incompatibility between that particular branch of science and their theology. And that is from theology. It's not from science, right? If their theology teaches them that there's something wrong with some branch of science, that's fine. But there's nothing that I can say to them about that. There's nothing that I can do to persuade them. I mean, I can show them everything and anything, but let's be clear. That has nothing to do with why they believe anything, right? If they're going to be open to the evidence, we first have to get them past the idea that they have to believe that humans did not evolve. And it's that belief that has to be dealt with first. Once it is, there's loads of things that the first thing, and I made this recommendation to pretty much everybody. Anybody that's interested at all should read Finding Darwin's God by Ken Miller. It is absolutely the best book. It is written by a Christian. Mm-hmm. Ken Miller is he's a professor at Brown University. He is a evolutionary biologist. He literally wrote the textbook, one of the major textbooks on evolution. He is a Christian. If you are a Christian and you are open to the idea that there's no inconsistency between evolution and your beliefs, then read that book. And that's my best recommendation there.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. It's been fun.
This was a good conversation. So, all right. Take care.
All right. Take care. Talk to you later.